What if I told you that you don't need JavaScript to do something dynamic on the web? JavaScript is a programming language used within browsers, and it helps you do dynamic things on the internet, but it comes with it a lot of complexity that we're going to talk about today. So we're going to look at a technology called htmx, but I wanted to frame the discussion by starting with JavaScript and what I think of the current state of JavaScript here in 2022. I've been doing JavaScript for a long time as a professional, so even though this is a Python meetup and I'm kind of known as the Python guy locally, like I do have pretty strong opinions about JavaScript that are informed by actual experience and not just because I'm some Python fanatic, which that's not really the case. I see a lot of flaws in the way that JavaScript is kind of managed in the world today. And we're going to look at a few of those big kind of categories before we get into the technology, which we'll be spending a lot of time looking at through demos. But when you consider JavaScript, one of the big areas that it struggles with, in my opinion, is its toolchain. Now, the toolchain, for those of you who have not spent a lot of time with this, is like all the tools that help you build JavaScript so that you can use it in applications. And in days of yore, JavaScript was something that you would add a little script HTML tag to your web page, and you'd write a little bit of JavaScript, and it would do something, and you'd have to deal with browser inconsistencies back in that day, but it was pretty straightforward about how you do that. And if your script got too large, you'd move it out of a script tag into a separate file, and you do a script include. But that was kind of the end of the story. So you just had your one JavaScript file, but it led to some problems as you got bigger and bigger. There were management issues with how would you deal with a lot of code if you had to do lots of dynamic things. Over time, tools came out to try and help with this problem, to try and optimize the size of the JavaScript files that were delivered in the browser, because with size comes cost of latency and download times and all these things. So a bunch of tools were built to try and make the experience with JavaScript better. And these tools solved a bunch of problems, but what has happened over the years is that the tools themselves have become one of the complex areas. So if you're working with JavaScript today, you might use a piece of software like Webpack. And if you've never worked with Webpack before, it is a whole ecosystem of plugins and file configurations and all this kind of stuff you have to do to produce an optimized JavaScript application. In days of yore, that might have been Grunt or Gulp to solve similar kinds of problems, but another challenge with the JavaScript ecosystem is that the tooling also changes pretty rapidly. So while Webpack might be a popular choice today, there are other tools out there that are coming on and that are becoming popular called like Parcel or Rollup is another one of them. And it's just this constant churn in the ecosystem and adding a lot of complexity onto a flow. When you're trying to deliver a web application that you want to just get an experience out there that actually works for people, and then you end up fighting with these kind of tools. So Toolchain is one of the big aspects of JavaScript that I think is a problem. More broadly, I think there are challenges in the ecosystem. In JavaScript applications, you will install packages, and you'll use something called npm to actually install your packages, and you can have a whole set of third-party packages that you used. There are challenges, though, with the way that is done, because the JavaScript community likes to break these packages down into very, very small things and compose them all together. And in theory, this works, but in practice, what I've found is that this leads to a lot of churn in what you're going to be building. So your applications will constantly be to some level out of date. And before we started recording, we were talking about tools to upgrade packages and automatic tools that help make sure you're staying secure in your applications. But it's a certain amount of overhead that you bring with the application just to get basic things done. So if you want to use a web framework that is based on JavaScript, it has a whole bunch of baggage that comes along with it that on top of adding all this complexity also brings with it size and the things that we were talking about earlier. So the toolchain becomes all the more critical. And so you have to kind of optimize your toolchain to take advantage of these packages, and it just is more complexity, trying to solve other complexity issues. I think there's also a challenge with the programming model itself in JavaScript. And I'm not referring to object-oriented programming or functional programming or any of those styles that are out there for how to program. What I'm really referring to is the way that web apps are often delivered today with JavaScript. And I've got a little diagram here to kind of illustrate what I think is the challenge. When you deliver a JavaScript application, you often build these JavaScript files into a bundle, and you might store them on a content delivery network so that when a user visits your website, the user will get the JavaScript files, and a JavaScript app will boot itself up. The browser will parse through the JavaScript, and the JavaScript knows how to start, and it's going to need data in order to actually show the user something interesting. And in that process, it will talk to back-end APIs in order to get that data. And that data usually comes from some source like a database. And in this diagram, since we're at Python Frederick, I've got an illustration of going from the database to a Python backend application and then communicating that data over JSON information, which is what a typical API will deliver. And then the JavaScript on the other side will receive that JSON data, will parse it into something that it understands, translate that into HTML, into using components and all these other techniques that are common in JavaScript apps. And then ultimately, that will be inserted into the DOM, which is the document object model. So if you know the browser, that's where the actual state of a web page lives. And to me, this is a process that has a lot of other challenges that I'm not even illustrating in the diagram. There are things in here that just can't be conveyed very simply. I described that you might be serving your files purely out of a CDN. A content delivery network is a place to optimize where anybody in the world could receive JavaScript files at a location that is close to them to try and, again, improve performance. But where that system lacks is when it comes to stuff like search engine optimization. Most search engines are improving, but there are still plenty of search engines out there that don't really know how to read JavaScript well. So when you want to optimize your site for being found on the internet, you then have to look into more complex tools of, now I need to render my application and send HTML to my user directly rather than going through this content delivery network to provide them an initial starting experience, or to provide them something that a search engine can browse and crawl and do all of that sort of stuff. And so the point is that there's just layers and layers of stuff here that I think for the average web application is way overkill. And so why you do that? I think the answer is, unless you're a company like a Google or a Facebook or an Amazon or one of these really big companies that has tons of engineering talent that they can throw at huge problems like this. And for those companies, I should be clear, it does make sense for them to do this. At a certain amount of scale, JavaScript can be a fantastic thing to build into your applications. But for an average person or a small team, it's a ton of extra complexity. So my recommendation is just don't. We have other options, and that's what we're going to explore today. We're going to explore a technology called htmx. And I don't know if the X officially stands for this, but you can think of the X as an extension to HTML, which we will see. And HTML is hypertext markup language. So the idea driving htmx is to integrate dynamic functionality using markup. We'll see what that means as we get into our demos. So we're going to spend a lot of our time looking at demos. And I've got 4 demos prepared, and I actually deliberately picked a variety of web frameworks. So we've got 2 that are Python web frameworks, but we also have one in Ruby, which is, we're going to use Ruby on Rails, another one in PHP we're going to show off Laravel. And the point here that that I'm trying to make by using a wide swath of frameworks is that this technology is not specific to a language. So just because you're at Python Frederick, it doesn't mean that you have to be using Python to make this work. It can be done on all sorts of stacks. You could do this on Perl CGI bin scripts if you remember that stuff. I wouldn't recommend it, but you could. So without further ado, we'll get into a terminal and actually look at some code. So we're going to start with my favorite language, or excuse me, my favorite web framework, and that's going to be Django. Django is a very popular full stack web framework in Python. So the very first thing I'm going to do, actually let's start totally fresh. So I'm going to hope that my internet is good enough here and move the existing virtual environment out of the way to old virtual environment. And then we will create a new virtual environment. And a virtual environment is a directory of code that holds Python packages and essentially gives you isolation so that you don't have to globally install your packages on your operating system. So if you have multiple projects, you can safely use them without them stomping on each other, basically. And we have to activate this. And you can notice on the left-hand side here that this virtual environment is now activated. So we're ready to use it. So I'm going to start by installing the Django web framework using Python's package installing tools. And we'll see, hopefully this goes okay. And if it doesn't, we can back out and use my pre-downloaded stuff. So I'm kind of testing fate here by seeing if internet will hold up during a presentation. Get to watch a pretty scroll bar. Okay, cool. So I've got something going on with my local shell, so don't worry about that step that I just did right there. It basically just refreshed my path so that the thing that we'll have next is available. So I'm going to make a new directory for this particular demo called Django demo. And I'm going to start with the Django admin command to build a project. We're not going to go into all the details of each of these web frameworks, so you can go learn more about each one on their documentation, but this should give you a flavor for what this is looking like. So now we have a new project, and we can go to this project, and from here we need to add an application. So one bit of context that will be needed is that in Django, it's kind of a tree, and the root of the tree is a project, and a Django project is made up of applications. You can think of applications as components within a Django app. So they've got a kind of a weird name, but that's what it is. So we're going to run this command called start app, and I'm going to create an application called core. And so we don't get bothered by weird messages later. We're going to do this migrate command that does some database stuff. Again, not super important to the particular topic, but just trying to make this sort of clean. So if we run the built-in web server now, we have now a server running that knows how to display Django stuff. And here we are. Let me resize this so it's a little bit bigger. So we're going to be coming back and forth between the actual browser and the terminal. So this just shows us that we got the very, very basics of Django going. Nothing exciting yet, but there's lots of cool stuff to come. So over here, I will start up my editor, and we're going to look at where are we going to look? At the settings of the Django application. And one of the things we need to do is take that component that we added, that core component, and add it to our list of applications. So there's this list called installed apps, and we should be able to just call this core to add this to what we need. The next thing that we have to do is wire up our core application to the URLs that this application will serve. So there's another file in here called URLs, and from here we should be able to say we need to add an import called include, and then we will put in a new path which is going to be at the root of the application. So we put it in an empty string, then we can say include core URLs. And this will make a little bit more sense once I wire all these pieces together properly. But essentially what this is going to do is any path, any route that we define in our Django core application will now be hooked into the main project. That's what really is happening at this stage. But before we can do this, like this URLs, this is for a Python module path. This URLs does not actually exist yet. So we need to go back to the core project and create a URLs py file that is going to be the home for our new paths and routes. Conventionally, there is a thing that we have to define called URL patterns, which was where all of our routes will live. And when Django starts up, it's going to look for this URL patterns list in each application and add anything that's in this list as a route that it can serve. Okay, so we're still not very far yet, though. If we go back to this and try to run the server again, I think what we're going to find is there's nothing here because we still haven't changed. We haven't added anything yet. We haven't actually added a place to go check. All right, so now we need to actually create a view, or in other lingo, this might be considered a controller. So if you are familiar with web application development, there's something called the MVC model. It stands for Model View Controller. And it's a common pattern that a lot of these web frameworks implement. They have slightly different names and terminology, but essentially a view is the actual Python code that's going to run and produce some HTML, and that will be connected to a path on your web application, some sort of route, and then served up appropriately there. So we are going to create, we already have this views file, and we're going to create a new view here and change this from that placeholder to something like this. The job of a view is to receive a request object and return a response object, so that's what we need to do. And one way to get a response object is to render something. So the render takes the request object, and it takes the location of a template, which we haven't created yet, and some context information, which is like extra data that you want to render in the template. So we now have this, and we can go and wire it to our URLs. So, whoops, that's the wrong URLs file. Excuse me. So from here, we can say from Django URLs, import path. So we want to add a path, and we want to add the path for the root of this particular app. So again, that's going to be an empty string, and we're going to give it the home view. So that's we're essentially connecting the route to the code that's going to run right now. Now this isn't compiled yet, or there's no compilation here, but this would not work yet, I should say, because we have not actually imported the view name. So we can do from views import home. All right, let's try this out so far. It should fail, but we'll see why it will fail. So now we have at the root of the application, so we're still at port 8000, and you can see that there's nothing to see yet, and it's telling us exactly why. It's saying that, hey, there's no template called home HTML. You need to make that exist. So we got to do a little bit of work there to go configure that. So if we go over back to our settings, and we're going to come down to the templates section here and define this. Again, this is all like details of Django that is in the documentation. We're getting to a stage where you can see an example. And Django has a little bit more setup than some of the other ones, so I promise this will get a little faster with future demos. So we're going to use the base directory and connect it to a thing called templates. And what this says is, hey, Django, look in your base directory, which is like the root of your project, for another directory named templates. And that's going to be the home of templates that we'll have. So if we come up to the root where we are, and we add a new directory called templates, and go in here and create a new file called home, which will be our template file. And now we save that. If we come back over here, this should now render. It's an empty page. There's nothing in that template yet, but it's where we need to be. Okay, so now is where we start to get more interesting stuff. So we're going to create an HTML file. And this will be a very basic HTML file. And it needs a head tag because although I said we are trying to avoid JavaScript, this library that we're going to use, htmx, actually is a JavaScript library. That's just an implementation detail. It just means there's one script you have to add to your project. In practice, the way you use it is not with JavaScript, but they had to do that. They had to extend it somehow. So they're using JavaScript to bring that along. And for convenience, I put the script tag here because we're going to use it from a content delivery network for now. If you are doing a project on your own, I'd recommend you go download the real htmx JavaScript file and serve this from your project. It removes the dependence on a CDN. So if something was ever wrong with unpackage.com, your application would not be affected. But it should be fine for our purposes. And most of the time, unpackage is not down, but just so you're aware. So this will not be a pretty application. We're not going to go through the effort of styling this. This is more a demonstration of some of the dynamics that happen with this to give you an idea. So we'll start, though, by putting in the actual code that we're going to need for this home template and this first example that I want to show. The example is going to dynamically add to the page a random row that has some color in it. And a randomly generated color just to show something dynamic. So what we want to do is create a link that we're going to add, and we need to give it a hash mark at least so that it will add the underline. If you don't include the href, that won't be included by the browser by default. But here's where we get to htmx. And we're going to use these data attributes on the tag to actually get the work done. And so we say AJAX, and that's the prefix for all of these attributes that we add. And you'll see how they kind of work in tandem. And the first part of this, the AJAX get, they map to HTTP verbs. If you know enough about the way the browser actually gets information, there are a bunch of verbs that a browser can use. This is all defined in the HTTP specification. So if you're ever wondered about what is that HTTP in the URL, it's because it's a protocol definition. And so there are verbs like get and post and put and patch and a handful of them. And so a typical browser mostly does GET requests. It's mostly asking for information from a server. And if you ever want to send information from a server, use a form and use a POST request. And those are possible through the normal interfaces of the browser. But to do other kinds of methods that are defined by HTTP, for some reason, the browsers don't give you a mechanism to do that. And here's where the extension aspect of HTMX comes into play. The library lets you do these other kinds of requests and unlock some dynamic functionality here. So in this context, we're going to do a simple GET request, but that is only one option out of many. Now we need to wire this together with a new route in Django that doesn't exist yet. So it's going to eventually be something called color. And so we're using Django template syntax here to substitute a URL, and I can show what this looks like in the rendered HTML at the end. We then want to say, when you go get this information from the backend, and it's going to produce some little fragment of HTML that we'll see, we need to put it somewhere. The whole goal of this is to make it so you're not doing a full page refresh every time you click a button, which is the normal default behavior of a browser. Instead, we want to say, hey, go get this little piece of information in the background and put it where I want you to put it in the DOM. dynamically. This is the dynamic aspect which is what makes htmx so interesting and appealing. So we have to tell it some behavior about how we want this included. And the documentation defines a bunch of different modes, but the one we're looking for this time is to use before end. And before end says to put something inside of some other place in the HTML, which we'll see in a second, and add it before the very end of that element. So where do we want to put it is the other question. So we need to give it a target. And so we'd say AJAX target, and we then provide a selector ID, which we'll be calling color me. And we'll finish this off by giving it some text of what the link will actually say for add color, like that. And then finally, we actually need to give our target. So we're going to provide a list, an unordered list, with that ID of color me. So the ID syntax here, this is not unique to HTMX. It's CSS selectors. So that hash color dash me is saying find an ID. That's what that hash means. So we've got ID color me, and for the time being, this will be empty. Okay, so that's our whole home template. Now, if I go back and try and render this, it's not going to work again because that URL thing that we added was not right. We don't have a URL for color yet, so we need to complete that. So we can go back to our core URLs, and that's my sample project, so that's not the right place. Over here. Here we go. And so we're going to add another path to this list, and that will be the location of our color that will give us a random color. And we'll call the view color, and it doesn't exist yet. So we're going to need to import that as well. And so now we've got a view that doesn't exist, but the URL path is defined. I guess there's one little last element. In order for that URL template tag that was trying to figure out what is the URL, it needs to have a name to match up with. So again, this is just Django specifics, so it's not super exciting, but we need that name to be there. Okay, if we return to the views, we're now going to take and define a new view called color. And we're going to ultimately need a new template as well, which we'll call color. But this is where we need to do something, want to do something interesting. We actually want a color to work with. I looked up a lot of ways that, like, how can you generate a random hexadecimal color that gets used on HTML? This is not knowledge that I had locked in my head because it's sort of a weird syntax. But essentially, it's a trick where they're using the hex notation of a string and then calling up a random integer from the range of all the hex colors that are available. So from 0 to the full RGB hex values. Okay, I hope that's clear enough. Like this line might look a little magical, I understand, but that's sort of what's going on there. And then we need to add this data to our what's called the context. And so the context is like when you're doing a render in this web application in Django, it takes context data, it was dictionary of data, and it takes your template and smashes the two together. And so the rendering engine, when it encounters variables, which we'll use in a second, will look for anything that was provided by the context. Now to complete this, to make sure that it still works, we need to import the random module, or else the rand_int call is not going to go. So now we have a new view. It's wired up properly, but we're still missing a template. So we're going to go back to our home template here, and we're going to add this new missing color template for HTML. And here, this is where, remember in the home template, we were trying to add a color inside an unordered list. So we wanted to put a list item, basically, is what we're looking for. And that's the tag that we're after. And so I'm not doing anything fancy here, so I'm going to do an inline style to set the background color in a crude way. I would not recommend using the style tag directly like this, but it will work for the demonstration. And we've got our hexadecimal value, which will be a 6-character hex color. And so we prefix it with a pound sign, and that should be the end of that. And then we can say just fill it in with some information so we have something to look at. What color am I? I am, and then a color. And so these curly, double curly bracket syntax is how you do a substitution of that context data into the template. I hope that makes some sense. All right, so I think we have all of the pieces together now to do the demonstration. I'm going to come back to this page, and now we've got our template. And first of all, we should have noticed that it rendered. So it was able to resolve that color URL. It was able to figure that out. And actually, if we go and look at the page, the source code, you can see the color URL is this /color/ thing. Now, if we click this button, assuming all is going well, hey, it works. So what happened is we called the backend, we called it with a color, and it returned that little list element fragment, filled in the color information, and it added it to the unordered list, and it added it before the end. So if I click it again, I can just keep kind of clicking, and here's where we get just all these random colors and tells you what their color value is. So the point of this demonstration was to show you can get something from a backend, and color is just like the simplest thing I could think of, but you could imagine fetching data and that's relevant to your application and having a button where it clicks it in and brings it into what you need. So that is our Django demo and the first thing that we can see with htmx. Anybody have any questions about this particular demonstration, or?
Not about the htmx, but about the script. The 06%, 06x, is that just saying it's base 6 or base x?
I think so.
Yes.
The question was about the %06x, and so I want to say that the x is to translate. So this is a random integer, so it could be 42, and it's to translate it to hex values and make sure that you pad it out by 6 characters. I think that's what's happening. So kind of a.
In base 6, whatever.
It's still hex base. I think that's what the x does, and then the 06 says prefix it with any zeros if there are any. Up to 6 times. So if you had 42 in decimal, I can't remember what that is in ASCII or in hex, but you're going to put in all of the zeros in front of it. So it's again, this is a weird one-liner that I found to generate some hex stuff. So it was a pretty clever technique to actually like specify it as a hex on the other side. That was the endpoint part that I was intrigued by. So that's Django, and with any luck, that's the most complex setup here, because I realize it's a lot to see. So let's go back and let's work on the next one. So Django is known to be a full stack framework. It has tons of features in it. It's kind of the kitchen sink model, and if you don't want something or you don't need to use something, you sort of just ignore it. That's the sort of the philosophy behind Django. I personally think that that's a great philosophy, because when you suddenly realize, oh yeah, I need this security feature, oh yeah, I need to do user management, it means that Django has already kind of provided a solution for you. There is another popular web framework called Flask in the Python ecosystem that is sort of the inverse model of that. It starts with a very minimal kernel of functionality, and then you layer in the extra things that you want. So that's sort of the difference between in philosophy between between Django and Flask. So Flask has just a few things that it needs to install, and then we're going to make a Flask demo. And the point of this next demonstration is to show an example of using a different non-get or post method. That's what we're going for. So let's start with, I think we could probably write out the whole application and then write out the template. I don't know, maybe we should go back and forth, I'm not sure. So by naming the app.py, it means Flask will automatically recognize it. You can name it a bunch of other things, but if you do so, you have to give Flask more instructions about which app you're using. So I'm going to use the conventional name here, and we're going to say from Flask, import Flask. We're going to need to render some stuff here too, so I'm going to also, while I'm here, bring in the render template, which we'll use in a moment. And you created a Flask app by calling Flask, and you have to give it a name. So we're going to give it the name of the file, which is what this double underscore name thing is. That's a Python thing. That's not a Flask thing. And similar to our Django views, we're going to have some routes, and those are actually done in a similar manner. And in fact, I'll give it the same kind of thing. But one of the differences is that Flask does not receive a request object like a Django view does. It just is an empty function. But it is going to look similar in the other half of it. So we can say render template, and we'll have a home HTML template. You don't provide a context dictionary like you do with Django. You just provide keyword arguments, which I guess we don't need to see that in this example, but that's how you would do it if you wanted to use Flask. Now, something different about Flask versus Django. In Django, you saw that we had to wire the view explicitly to a route in a separate file. But with Flask, you can do that with a decorator, and you can define the route name and the route that you want to go to. So it leads to a pretty concise syntax. A lot of people love Flask, and I love a lot about it. I happen to prefer the kitchen sink approach. I wish it'd be nice if there was a Flask that had all the pieces built into it, and maybe there is somewhere out there, but this is the basics of Flask. So I actually opened up that in not the place I want. I wanted to leave this up for running the application, but now we have a basic home route, and we can try and run the Flask server. So to run Flask in its development mode, we need to provide an environment variable, and we need to give that Flask environment variable the mode of development. So that will do the automatic reloading of the application for us. That won't happen if we don't provide that. And then we say Flask run, although I think that might, oh, good, still works. So you can see this one is serving on localhost over port 5000, but if we visit this URL, it's going to fail for the same reason as the other one failed, because we haven't created the template yet. Coming over to this code area, Flask, following conventions again, we'll just look for a directory called templates. So rather than defining that or having to configure that, we can just create the directory called templates. We can go in there and create the new file, which would be home.html, and save that file. Now if we return over here, the template now exists. Hopefully the reloading is happening automatically, and it's an empty file. Okay, so I'm going to steal from our home template from before, because a lot of the structure is the same, and we don't need to keep copying me typing that over and over again. So the difference in the interesting part this time is that we want to replace the body, and I want to show an example of deleting things out of, in this case, a table. So we'll create a table, and we're going to add a table row, and then every table you have to define cells. So that's what the TD tag is for. And then finally, well, actually we need we need two cells. So we're gonna have a 2x2 table. You're not gonna be able to see that in the styling here, but that's what we'll have. And we can just fill it with something meaningless stuff. And then on the second cell is where we're going to put the actual htmx things. Again, we're going to use an anchor tag, and we're going to provide href of a hash just so we can see the underline. And we're going to use AJAX again, but this time instead of using a get, we're going to use a delete. And I'm going to say delete with, I'm not going to use any of the routing features like we did on the Django one. We'll just hard code the URLs for the demo. So we're going to say delete of 1. And our AJAX target will be, this is some other cool functionality in htmx, is you can specify things in terms of relative positioning. So we're going to say the closest tr, so the closest table row, is what we're going to target. And then finally, we're actually going to throw in another aspect of confirming the deletion. So, people usually get unnerved when you delete things with a single click. So we're going to add in a confirmation box that says, "Are you sure?" And then we'll put in the text of the button, which will just be "delete me." So now if we refresh, again, this is not fancy styling, but you can see way up here, that's teeny tiny, holy moly. We've got our delete me, okay? And to complete the example, we'll put in another row, and you can think of, in proper rendering, you would have like looped over something here. You most likely are not putting in a hard-coded table, but for this demonstration, this will work. So we've got more stuff, and then we're going to have a delete of 2. Now, we don't have a delete route yet. There's nothing there. So that's the other piece of this that we need to create. But our template is done. What we ultimately want this to have happen here is when I click this, here's the confirmation thing. Okay, nothing happened. In fact, something did happen, but it was a 404 that you couldn't see because the developer tools weren't up. So we want to make that not be a 404 and actually have htmx do something with it. So if we return back to our app file, which went somewhere, where did you go? Oh, I opened it in a different thing. Now we want to add a new view called delete, or I guess delete row. So we want a new route, and the route is going to be /delete, like we put in the template, and it's going to take an argument for this demonstration, and we want that to be an integer, and the name we want to give that thing is row ID. And so this is the placement syntax for Flask, and then you'll see how this is used in just a second. And then specifically, we want to say that this particular route will only respond to a delete HTTP request. Not a get, not a post, not a patch, none of those other things, just a delete. Then we're ready to define this as delete row. And because we added that int thing above, we're going to get, Flask will provide an argument to our function. So it will provide it as this first argument of row ID. And for the function itself, we can print out just something. But you can imagine in a real application, this might be where you're actually trying to delete some data. So the user has provided a row ID from some row in your database table that you want to delete from, and here is where you would do that deletion operation. And then in the end, what we're going to return is nothing. We want to purposefully return an empty string. Now, I'm going to refresh over here. Now if I click delete me and confirm it, it goes away. So what happened? When we did the delete command, the backend responded with an HTTP response that was an HTML fragment of nothing. And the target, if you remember, was the closest table row. And so because it was empty, it said, okay, I'm going to replace this table row with the empty string. So the effect is, what you see in the UI is that that whole row is deleted. What I'm not showing here, there's a lot more ways that you can make this fancier. There are aspects of this kit that can hook into CSS, and there are some classes that htmx will try to add as it's doing things, and then you can affect the timing. And so you can do fancy fade outs and stuff if you don't want to, like, have that hard delete. It can be pretty jarring to see it that way. So you can add a nicer aesthetic to this, but the actual mechanism for the deletion was pretty dead simple. And then on the Flask side, you can see here that we got the actual ID. So you can imagine that the row would have actually been deleted in your database if you'd done that with whatever database technology you're using. So that's the second example. That one was a lot simpler than the first one, I think. Any questions about that aspect?
So in this case, it just rewrote that file.
So the browser had already rendered out the full chunk of HTML, and that was inserted in the DOM in the browser. It was already there. And when the user clicked the link, it went to the delete URL, and it happened as an AJAX request. It's not like a full page refresh. So the AJAX request happened. The browser, the backend, the Flask application, responded with nothing. htmx is the one listening for that response. Once it got that response back, it was then able to say, let me look at the target, which was listed as the closest table row. It found that target inside of the DOM, and then removed that element from the DOM by doing, I think the default is to do what's called an inner HTML attribute. So you can set things on the DOM in different ways. And so it set the inner HTML of that table row with nothing, which is what effectively nukes the row.
So is the row still there, just an empty string, or is it gone?
Good question. Let's take a look, see what we can find. So here's the table. Here's the table body. I guess you're right. I think it's still there. It's just all of the cells have been removed. Yeah, that's good. I hadn't thought about that, but yep, there it is.
Yeah, so I guess if you refresh this whole page.
Yeah, or we can watch, here, how about I'm going to leave the inspect tools up, and let's click delete me and see if should dynamically delete out those two cells. Yep, there they go. Goodbye. Cool. Hadn't thought about that. Good observation there, Matt. So one of the things I'm hoping you're starting to see with this is that Django, Flask, it didn't matter. He was like, as long as you can render a chunk of HTML, you can do the thing. Like htmx is where the flexibility is really coming into this equation. All right, let's turn to another example. This time we're going to move on from Ruby, and this is where hopefully I'm being sharp, because I'm not a Ruby expert by any stretch. But we're going to use Rails. And I've already installed Rails locally, so we're not going to use a virtual environment for anything here. We're just going to assume that you have been able to be in a context where you have installed Rails yourself if you're interested in Ruby. But we're going to say Rails new and then Rails demo. And Rails is pretty slick in a lot of ways. There were a lot of things that I really appreciated about this as I was using it. I'm not wild about Ruby itself, but the way Rails is put together is pretty cool. So this is doing a bunch of work for us. And when we go into the Rails demo area, Rails generated a lot of files here. So Rails is a very particular structure. The project ethos is convention over configuration, where you saw Django, we had to wire things a lot together ourselves. Rails is very much like, no. If you just put it in the right spot, I'll find it. I got it. Which is great if you know Rails, but as you're learning Rails, you're like, wait, why did I pick up on that again? So it's kind of the double-edged sword with Rails. So you can be hyper efficient in it if you're a long-time user of Rails, but it takes some getting used to. So now we're in our Rails demo, and the first thing we want to do is generate a Rails controller. So Rails, comes with a bunch of generation commands. These are like scaffolding commands that will do some file generation for you automatically. And so a controller kind of maps to a Django view. They're sort of one and the same, the chunk of code that's going to run before, to handle your actual application logic. And so we need to give the controller a name, and then we want to give it a first kind of route. There's a little bit of an inversion here in that Rails controllers are meant to handle a bunch of different paths, or can handle a bunch of different paths. So we're going to create an index part of the controller. So here you can see all of the files that it made for us, and I don't know what all of them do, but the one thing to call out is see that file that says index.html.erb. Django calls them templates, Rails calls them views. So this is where it starts to get confusing. It's like Django calls views controllers, and
so Rails is actually an MVC framework as opposed to...
Rails is closer to the MVC terminology than Django is. Yes, I agree with that statement. Same concepts though. Like in practice, they're pretty functionally equivalent. Okay, so now we've got our Rails project. So let's go over there. And the first place to start with is probably the view itself. Well, actually, why don't we start up the Rails server so you can see it running. And I did not think to write down the Rails command to, I think it's Rails serve. Oh no. Rails, oh boy, lots of commands. Rails, what? It's one of these. Runner? No. Well, I apologize, y'all. I didn't think to. All right. It's probably in bin. Let me search my history. That's embarrassing, but hey, it happens. Server. Okay. So we want to start the Rails server. And so now we have this thing. So they all pick their own ports for different reasons. So this Rails is now running at port 3000. So we've got 8000, 5000, 3000. We're going down here. All right, so Rails is running. Here's the Ruby version it's on, a bunch of information. It's all diagnostic. And if we go into the home controller and then the index, you can see we've got this thing telling me what's there. So what we don't have though yet is we haven't wired the home controller up to the root of the Rails application. And so that's what's missing. So if we come back up into the app, I believe, nope. It's in the config routes. So you can see you could go to a certain path and get this home. I think it would be just /home. I'm not positive on that. But we need to tell Rails, hey, I want you to treat the root of the I want you to get the root of the application, so the / as my home controller on its index method. So now if we come back here, now we get this, which is gigantic. So we are positioned to fill in that home template and then put in the rest of the demonstration. So let's go back to the Flask demo again. We're going to just steal from these to give you this sense of, hey, we're just using HTML in all these places. This is cool. And then we can get rid of all of inside of that body. And this time we're going to do like a search example, a search and filter kind of thing. So you can imagine a scenario where you want to display a bunch of information. You'd love to be able to dynamically filter it down. That's kind of what we're after. And it's sort of impressive that with some markup style, rather than some like JavaScript and replacing things dynamically, you can get what we're after. So we're going to create an input tag. And I'm going to give it a type of search. I think some browsers can actually understand what that type means. And we are going to give this thing a name. This is what's going to be submitted. So when you actually do the submission, the name will be passed along as a query string parameter. And if Q just happens to be one that's used by a lot of search engines, so we're going to call it Q. And we can give it some placeholder text. And we'll say search for a name. And here's where we introduce htmx. We're going to use an AJAX get. And our route that we're going to call is /search. And now here's where we get to another aspect of htmx that we haven't seen. We're going to do a trigger. What are the kinds of conditions? And the previous triggers have been very action oriented, like you click a button and it immediately goes. But that's not the kind of behavior we want here, because we, in this context of searching, don't want to like spam our server with a flood of requests every time somebody immediately types a character. That's not the experience that the user generally expects, because it's like you could type a single character and you get results. And I mean, maybe if you're Google and you have fantastic results, that might be what you want actually, but for most searches, that's not quite it. So what we're going to actually do is wait for a key up, and these are all tied to browser types of events that are well defined, and we're going to wait for it to be changed, and we're going to add a delay deliberately of 500 milliseconds to and that gives the user time to type a bunch and settle. So they've typed their characters out, and then that whole query goes on as one query. That's going to be the thing that prevents a flood of queries on the server. And then what we want to do is, honestly, I don't remember why this particular aspect was needed, to be blunt, but we have an extra part of the trigger, which is search. But we want to provide a target, a different target, where we're going to display the results, and that will be something that has an ID of results. And then we can end our input tag. And then, again, we'll just use an unordered list with an ID of results. So this is all of the htmx that you had to do to get this whole search functionality going. Now, the rest of the work is on the actual backend, because if we come over here and, well, why did that should have, there we go. So here's our little search box, and I can type some stuff, but there's nothing here yet. And so you can see it got a 404 from the server again. So we need to fill in the other half on the Rails side. So let's go back to Rails, and we're going to modify our the controller. Where did that go? Okay. I'll just navigate to it. Maybe I didn't actually open it. So here's our controller, the home controller that was generated by Rails when we ran that Rails command. And you can see it has this empty index method. That's what wires it up. And again, it's all about conventions. So the fact that this index method existed meant that Rails knew to look for an index.html ERB template. And I don't remember what ERB stands for, but it's the Rails template syntax is what the extension is for. So what we need to do is we need to add the search function, the search method that we want to have. And then we're going to fill it with some values that will actually display. Again, you can think of this could come from a database or a search, like any kind of technology that you want to bake in here. But we're going to be a pretty dumb approach of hard coding some items. So we're going to hard code Python and Ruby and PHP, because those are the languages we're using tonight. And then in the search, we want to actually check on the request. This request object is just kind of magically available in Rails. And so we want to say query parameters. That's what we're looking for. And we're looking for one named Q. And we're hoping that it doesn't equal, that it's not empty. And if it's not empty, then we want to do something. So if it's not empty, we want to filter it. And the way to filter it is with select. And with Ruby, you can do something called, I think they're called blocks, where it's kind of like a closure, but it's a little like mini function sort of thing. So the select is going to take all the items in the list, and then we want to check if the item includes the request query parameters. So this is a very crude search. Just like, does it contain this at all? That's all this is trying to say. And then finally, what we need to do so in the other examples, we had like context that we were adding to the render function. With Rails, what you do is you add an instance variable to expose that to the ERB template. So we had a local variable with items, and now we're adding it to this particular controller, because Rails, every time it handles a request, will create a controller, and anything that gets added to that controller then goes onto the rendering process. So we've got this list of items that are now available to our template. Okay, so we need two more things to finish this all off. Let's go first. Let's add the route. Whoops, I guess I forgot to say that. Let's add our new route that we care about. And so that's going to be, the new route is get, and it will be called search, because that's what we called it in the input. And we're going to wire it to the home search method, the controller's search method, that thing we just implemented. Finally, we need to go to our ERB templates, and we're in the home controller, so we need a new template here, and that's going to be the search. Again, it's all convention based, so this will be search, HTML, ERB. And here's where I really need to look at my notes, because I don't know Rails ERB syntax at all, and there were lots of characters that when I did this the first time. So we want to say for each item, and then we want to go through each item. So it's essentially a way to do a for loop. And then here's the thing that we actually want to produce as our result. So we want to produce a list item, and then we want to fill it in. Fill it in with a value of the item itself. So that should be a string when we're done. And then we can close off the list item. And then we can close off the whole each looping structure. Whoops, I'm using the wrong syntax. That needs to be that. So, did everybody see this example? It's a loop over some items. That should be it. So if I did it all correctly, this route should now exist. So we should be able to come back to this page. Let's refresh it. And I'm leaving the dev tools up there so we can see some stuff in the corner. But I'm going to start by just deleting that stuff. And what it did is, after the 500 milliseconds were done, it went and it got the items and rendered them and returned them and plopped them in the list using the target. And since the target didn't specify how to replace it, it just did an inner HTML swap and swapped out the list, the unordered list, for the list of items. If we filter this at all, we type P, now we've got our two items that contain a P. If we switch it to R, now we've got Ruby. So in what was that, maybe 20 lines of code, we got a full search filtering feature with no JavaScript. I think it's pretty slick. Any questions about that particular demo? Cool. We got one more to kind of round out the whole conversation. This time we're going to switch to PHP, because why not? Yeah, this was quite a journey as I was pulling this thing together. It's like, I've never used Laravel before. How is it? And it's pretty pleasant. Like, I can understand why people like these different things. So ending our demo list here, one of the things you need if you're going to use PHP is a thing called Composer. And I've already got, I should already have Composer available here. Yep, I do. And so we're going to create a new Laravel project, which is very similar to Rails in a lot of ways. Both, I would say, of the four that we're looking at this evening, Flask is the odd one out. Rails and Laravel and Django are all very much we're going to give you all the things, and you have a whole tool set to work from. And I think that is a testament to their popularity. It's like, well, it's a whole set of opinionated choices made for you. So we're going to get a Laravel demo going here. Okay, so got our Laravel project started. And where to begin? I think we want to begin with our routes, I believe. So like Rails, it has an app thing. And is that the actual file? Sorry. Oh goodness, where did the routes? There it is. Sorry. There's an app thing that you use for other purposes, but we already have in the Laravel app a welcome view. It sticks to more Rails-like terminology, so views are templates in this context, not controllers. And here, it's wiring the route directly to an inline function. So I think you have the ability to separate this and have a controller area if you want to. But for the purpose of getting you started in Laravel, they're just like, hey, just put your code here. So we're just going to do that today. We're not actually going to separate controllers. There's no real reason to. And we're going to actually take advantage of this welcome template as well. So first, let's find that welcome template. There is a resources directory, and it's got views, and there's this welcome blade template. And it's got a bunch of stuff in it. So probably helps if we start the server. How about that? So PHP artisan serve is the way to do this in Laravel. And we can open up port 8000, and you can see that this is what the Laravel version of this looks like. They do a good job. They point you right to the documentation, get you going. I've been pretty impressed with the way this project structures its presentation of information to other people. But we don't care about all that stuff. So let's just nuke it. And then we can go back. And again, we're going to start from the same base and pull in htmx and go to our welcome template. And we're going to delete all this stuff. Whoops, that's not too much. Delete all of, come on, Matt. Delete all the stuff. So if we refresh the page, now we're left with an empty template again. Okay, this demo is going to be the classic endless scroll kind of demo. That's what we're going for here. So we'll start with an anchor tag, and like all the others, it's an href that starts with a hash, and it's going to be an AJAX get to a route, which we'll just call more. We're going to go get more stuff, and our target for this example is the content target. It's the place where we're going to put stuff. And then we need some sort of starting message. So I said, start the fire hose. And on this side, we need a div with an ID to match that target. So we're going to put content. And that's the whole of that template. There's not much to it. If we refresh over here, this again, there's no more yet. So 404s as we would expect. All right. So let's return to this routes, and we're going to do our inline thing here. And to do that, we need a new route. It's going to be, predictably, more. And we're going to do an inline function, just like the other ones. I almost guarantee that I'm going to mess this up and forget a semicolon. That was one thing that bit me as I was doing this demo, is like, I forgot that PHP requires semicolons in different places. So we need to, with our route, return in another view, and we're going to give this thing a name of more, just like we had with the other one. And PHP's syntax for doing kind of dictionary things, I think they're called associative arrays in PHP, I could be wrong on that, is using this arrow syntax. It looks a little interesting, I'll say. And there's more sigils and syntax here, but we're gonna back up to this definition. Essentially, what I'm trying to show is we're going to put a set of values into a template that we're going to iterate over. And the only difference between every call is what the starting point is. You'll see why in a second. So did I get that right? Close that list, close that function, semicolon. Wow, okay, got it. Now, next, the thing we want to do is check on, well, you know what, let's just leave that for a moment. So we've got this, the start variables aren't there yet, but we're also going to need the template. So I think I could show you what the rest of this view is supposed to be, or this controller is supposed to be, but I don't think it makes sense until we have the template, because the interesting part of this demonstration is that there's actually htmx in the thing that we're rendering. So in all of our previous examples, it's been like htmx has been at the starting point, but in this example, we're going to show that you can add htmx in the thing that you call, and that htmx triggers more htmx. So the library knows how to interpret that and connect it in and wire it in appropriately. So let's return to our welcome, Laravel calls them blade templates, and we'll make a new one. So let's go up and start our new template, which will be more.blade.php, and it's empty, but we're going to do a for loop. So we say at for each. So at seems to be the popular thing to replace stuff in blade templates. And this is where we're going to use our values that we are getting from the controller, which is that range of numbers. So we're going to say for each values as value is the syntax for this. And then, just so I don't forget it later, I'm going to go ahead and end the for each here. So this is where we are going to put each value. And let's start with the default thing. So most of the time for these things, we just want to see a div that says more content with a value of, and then replace whatever the value is. So if it starts out at 1, we're going to see 1, 2, all the way up to 50, right? So this, if we do this right now, this would just end. In fact, we probably, will this work? Nope, it won't work yet because our other side doesn't have a start variable. Let's just hard code that in for a moment to a value of 1. So this should go 1 through 50, I think. If we refresh this and click the button, hey, cool. We got started at 1, we went all the way to 50. 51 apparently, but then it stops, okay? So what we want to do is we want that endless scroll capability. So now we're going to come in here and return to our template and change it. So we want to have something different on the very last element in this list. And so we can do that by taking advantage of the fact that Laravel has this like special looping value when you're doing a for each. So you can say for each and then look at this value that's available, and if loop is last, then we're going to do something, and otherwise we're going to do something else. And then we need to have an end if. So the else case is the thing that we have right here, right? So that's the default thing that we want, and we just want to do something different on the last one. So let's copy this, and here's where we want to change this div. So we want everything to basically be the same, but we're going to add some attributes here. So we're going to say AJAX get, and we're going to call the same more URL, but we're going to give it a query parameter. We're going to say that last is equal to our value. So we've got that as the query parameter that we'll eventually use. Now here's where the endless scroll aspect comes into play. You can do an AJAX trigger on being revealed. So as soon as it comes into view, that's what's going to cause htmx to do the actual change. And then finally, we want to have a swap thing that puts the stuff at the end. So we'll say AJAX swap is after the end of the list. Okay? So those are all of our attributes that we need, and I think that's it for the template. If we return now to the route and modify this, so we can now look for the presence of that last query string argument. So we can say if request and then has last. That's how you look for query string arguments in this framework. And then we open that up. And eventually we're going to want the else as well. So the else is our start case when you're going to this page for the first time. So that's when you want it to start with 1. But otherwise, we want to actually use that last value. Now I'm making an assumption here that it looks like an integer. So this isn't super robust code, but it works for now. So we want to cast as an integer the query string value of last. So we looked to make sure we looked before we leap. We made sure that it existed, and then we set that start variable. We actually want the one after it, so we want to do an increment here. This was a classic. I made an off by 1 error when I was putting the demo together. I'm like, oh, right, that's not. I don't want the number to repeat. So we had to increment 1 here to get that going. So now let's refresh the page. If we start the fire hose, we've got, and I'll switch it over to the network tab so you can see it called more. If I go to the bottom, if we all did everything properly, you can see, oh, it just like popped right in. And then you can see down here, it said last of 51. So I can scroll and kind of keep scrolling. In my opinion, a more elegant implementation of this might put the reveal logic like in the middle of the list, so that as you're going through the content, you like, because if you, and it's kind of maybe a little hard to see here, but if I go super fast and get to the bottom, like there's a brief moment where it's not there. And if you look at all of like the Facebooks and the Twitters and stuff, like you never get that moment. It's just they're constantly loading it when you're partially through. But there it is. There's endless scroll. Again, like this wasn't a crazy amount of code. It was probably, again, 20, 30 lines, maybe, tops. And it's pretty slick. So, yeah, go ahead.
What would happen if you had a footer on that page? You would never get to it, right?
Right. Yep.
Or maybe it would if you wanted.
You'd probably, so the question was that what would happen if you had a footer on the page? I think you might be able to get all the way to it, and for that brief moment where it's gone to the back end and is like getting you more information, you could see the footer, and you're probably going to drive your users crazy if you do this. And I think this is one of the reasons why folks' opinion on endless scroll is like mixed.
I was thinking, sometimes you try to get down to the footer of the page, you can't because it's
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. So that's HTMX, or that's a lot of examples of HTMX. And I actually borrowed the examples. I've reformatted them to fit in different frameworks so you could see them actually functioning. But if you go to htmx.org, you can see these examples in the author's way of showing them, and a whole lot more. Like you can click any of these. Let's try a dialogue. I don't know. I've not actually clicked this, so I don't know how it's going to go. But the author gives you an example of how to do this, what to call, and then at the bottom, there's the demo. So we can click that, and oh, cool, it popped over, and fancy. So you can use this as a guide to say, like, here are all these other patterns. So I borrowed patterns that were all defined in this reference. Every single thing you saw tonight, I believe, like, here's delete row. We did infinite scroll. We did search. We did all of these things. They actually, so credit where credit is due. This was not unique creations on my part. This was borrowed from the HTMX documentation. But I find that HTMX is a really powerful way to add some dynamic flair to a website, to avoid page reloads when you want it. And then the beautiful part is, like, if you don't want it, you don't need it. Like, you can, most of the time, it is okay for a standard application to just refresh the page, to just do a page load, and assuming your application is performant enough, that's totally adequate. But when you need something a little bit fancier, when you need to delete rows and make it look dynamic, and you're getting those requests from your users, this is a good tool that you can reach for and don't have to pull in JavaScript. So with that, that's the end of the presentation. That's what I've got. I'm happy to take any more questions, but otherwise we'll wrap up for the night. Okay, thank you all. Appreciate it.